I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernko.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff, and I really like the Carnival Barker energy you've got today, Matt.
Well, I have it because I'm ready to tell you about some of the Bible's most horrifying and terrifying cryptids.
The big circus.
We've got the dragon and two different beasts from Revelation. It's finally time to talk about the big scary monsters in this big book.
It's the best one. I like all these big weird monsters. The big menagerie of spooky guys in Revelation. It's what everybody has always wanted to talk about. I feel like, who knows if we'll even make it through the entirety of this chapter. My guess is not. But we should do our best. I'm just feeling like I already know I'm going to get distracted talking about this one big beast with too many heads. Does he have 6, 7, 8? Nobody really knows. It's just a lot going on in here, but I'm excited to finally get there. The mark of the beast is in here, 666. All your favorite evangelical tropes will finally be debunked, revealed. This is the big Magnificast beast one.
That's right. If this is the first time you're coming to the Magnificast, then you're in for a wild ride. Over the last few weeks, we've been reading Pablo Ricard's Apocalypse, a people's commentary on the book of Revelation, which is a big liberation theology text about, as you might guess, the book of Revelation. We've gotten through a lot of it so far. We talked about the bowls and the trumpets last week. We've talked about the churches, all of it. It's been great so far. We found that we've been our interest has peaked in this book. There are themes here that are still with us today. Wow. But this week we're up to Revelation chapter 12:1 through 15:4. There's kind of a weird out of orderness to the way that we've been tackling this, or that Richard tackles it, I suppose. But that's fine. No big deal. Last week we kind of had the 12 trumpets and the 12 bowls. I'm sorry. Oh my God. Last week we had the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls. And the stuff that comes today about the beast, about Satan, about the war in heaven, about all of it, the mark of the beast, that all is happening kind of interstitially between the 6th and 7th trumpet/bowl. Interestingly enough, as Richard tells us, so that's fine. We're not going to get to the very end of chapter 15 where we have the angels coming back in with more plagues. But
this is a real angel break.
We're taking a little bit of break from these angels. Last week we had so many of them, and this week we're going to really just be focusing on the monsters, on the beasts and dragons, and I'm psyched for it, to be honest. This is the cool stuff in Revelation. This is the stuff that when you are bored in church and you're flipping to the back of the Bible, you want to get to because it's the most interesting and weird content in the entire Bible. It can definitely, as the pastor is up giving the 6th or 7th altar call, this is a great way to sort of distract yourself from the mind-numbing boredom that you might have been feeling. And today we're going to find out maybe about what it means a little bit more than when we were teens, distracting ourselves.
That's right. Also a rare opportunity for Protestants to get some dragon content. We have more of it in our Bible, the cooler Catholic Bible. So I feel like you got to take what you can get. Okay, so one thing that's very interesting thematically about this kind of section is that Pablo Richard says the moments between the 6th and 7th trumpets and bowls are the center of revelation and also the center of history. So all the stuff we were talking about last time, where there's the earth, it's got a third of the water is blood, a third of it is poison, there's a burning mountain in there, everything's looking pretty bad, people are covered in sores. So much has already happened in the world so far. And we learn that there's also a big war in heaven that's going on. And wouldn't you know it, the good guys win in heaven. But it is actually bad news for the people on Earth. During the war in heaven, there is a pretty wild moment where there's like a celestial lady and she's getting pursued by a big spooky dragon, and the dragon is defeated. That's your first monster here in the book. Satan, who is a complicated figure that we'll talk about later, gets thrown down to Earth. Then some beasts, they come up. The dragon also ends up on Earth and starts chasing a different woman. Or maybe it's the same woman. Nobody really knows. Pablo Richard knows. The dragon is down here on Earth, and lots of other spooky guys start coming up around the Earth. So the war in heaven, they won it, but all the bad guys had to go somewhere, and bad news, they came to the Earth. The people who follow the Lamb, we find out it's definitely no picnic for them. They become the targets of evil because they're kind of the like analogous presence of heaven on Earth in some respects. There's like always a mirroring happening between the victory in heaven and the kind of persistence and resistance that's going on Earth. But they're surrounded by all kinds of weird stuff and weird guys. So we're going to break down some of the weird stuff and weird guys, and maybe we'll talk about the resistance part later on, but I don't know, like you said, this is the part where you're bored in church, and this will cure your boredom. I thought, Matt, maybe we could at least just read the couple of sections on the two beasts that are involved here, and that will at least give us a cool mental image of who exactly we're dealing with.
No, that sounds good. Yeah, great. Let's get to these beasts.
All right, beast number 1, Revelation 13. This is the beast that comes out of the sea. So he says, I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads. And on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. The weirdest taxidermied creature you've ever heard of. And the dragon gave it his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its fatal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given the authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? So there's your first big monster wandering around. The dragon is behind it, but the beast is pretty spooky and cannot seem to be defeated. The second beast comes pretty soon after that in the same chapter. He says, then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had 2 horns, like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. How a dragon speaks, I can't say, but there you have it. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived, and it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak, and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also, a quick appendix here. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be given a brand on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the brand, that is, the name of the beast or the number for its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number for a person. Its number is 666. So we've got 2 beasts, one coming out of the sea, one coming out of the earth, and then we've also got the mark of the beast going on in here. Lots of different stuff. I do have to admit, I had an extremely funny evangelical conspiracy moment reading it, being like, oh yeah, the second beast, that's Donald Trump for sure. He was wounded, but he didn't die. His wound was healed. he's deceiving everybody. He called down fire on Iran. He's blowing stuff up. People are deceived. Christians think he's great. So sorry to report, I too have become a great second beast conspiracy theorist, and that is Donald Trump. But anyway, lots of interesting imagery going on here. Matt, what do you think about these big spooky guys?
Yeah, that's very funny that Donald Trump is the second beast. He speaks like a dragon. Listen, folks, let me tell ya.
That's how dragons talk.
The worst Donald Trump impression of all time. That's okay because unlike him, I don't speak like a dragon. Yeah, that's great. That's great. These great big beasts. Okay, man. There's so many interesting things going on here that I definitely did not pick up on reading like myself. I need somebody like Pablo Richard to explain them to me, because there's so many like small nuances here that I think make a big difference when we're actually getting to it. Cool. We'll talk about the beasts in 2 seconds. But before that, let's talk about the role of myth within Revelation. This is where Richard starts his chapter. Because, I mean, obviously there's a lot of sort of mythological, things going on here. We have we have a woman who has a baby, and the baby is brought up to God. We have dragons, we have beasts, we have all kinds of like wild and wacky monsters. And Richard thinks that, these are fundamentally myths and that we have to understand them as a mythic language. But importantly, the myths that are being expressed here are, kind of being twisted, subverted, changed, and used to empower the Christian community at the time. So, Richard says that the author of Revelation may have been familiar with the myths of the Roman Empire and the Egyptian Empire and all kinds of other sort of empires, because he's using language and imagery that are similar to lots of sort of ancient world myths that people would have known. In the particular context of the Roman Empire, he undermines the dominant myth. The empire is not divine, but satanic. The emperors are not the incarnation of Apollo, but heads on a monster that is indeed satanic. Rome is a prostitute rather than a goddess. It's the new Babylon, the mother of all prostitutes on earth. Furthermore, the mother is neither Isis, Leth, or Roma, but the people of God, from whom the Messiah, Jesus, is born. The Roman Empire kills Jesus, but even so, his blood and the testimony of the martyrs are able to defeat Satan, which is the force that endows the empire with power. This empire is represented as a beast in chapter 13, with the same features as those of the satanic monster. The undermining of myths by Revelation has an impact on the minds of Christians by creating a new consciousness and a new praxis in history. And then he concludes saying that myth is power. And you can kind of see how that's the case in these sort of like big, epic, sweeping mythological scenes that he's laying out, right? We'll talk about, exactly what some of those myths might mean more in a minute, but they're all of these sort of like mythological moments that people reading the text would be familiar with just through sort of, popular culture. I mean, if nothing else, myth is popular culture. And what he's doing in Revelation here is twisting some of those common popular culture mythological moments and using them to tell a slightly different story. So, I don't know. Pretty cool, and it makes more sense, right? The stuff that's going on here isn't as scary as it seems. It's somebody cashing in on all of these sort of like cultural moments that people reading are familiar with, and then like riffing on them in a way that's sort of changing up a bit so that they fit a different context. It's he's hijacking the popular sort of mythology and turning it so that it can have a different meaning.
Yeah, I mean, it is similar to what we've been saying so far on the show, that the book is kind of a pastiche, or like a collection of a bunch of different symbols and images all kind of stacked on top of each other. And some of them are maybe more or less effective at kind of driving the point home. But the key is to just get it all out there. Like the more content there is, the more myth there is, the more opportunities you have to kind of get the point, which is kind of ironic, I guess, because for modern readers, the myths get in the way of getting the point. But what John is trying to do is to give you a ton of different ways to sort of achieve the same understanding of Rome as an empire that inherits all the characteristics of biblical examples of empires, and Jesus, and also the people of God, who kind of pull in all the opposite characteristics in the Bible, that they're the resistors, the kind of patient remnant, the people of the Exodus, all these alternative moments of kind of the liberation tradition in the Bible. Those also get kind of stacked on top of each other. It's one reason also why I think it's kind of helpful, again, the way that Richard says, you're not really trying when you encounter a myth to like boil it down into its obvious component referent or parts. I mean, you do it insofar as you can kind of understand the myth a bit better. But the key is to allow the myth to evoke the bizarre, even contradictory images that it can call up. So there's kind of like an interesting dialectical relationship there where like you're trying to explain the myth on the one hand, but you're not doing that with the ultimate interest of like revealing the scientific truth of it or something like that, or like the secret behind it. But on the contrary, you're trying to understand it so that you can actually let the full weight of the absurdity of it really like hit you in a way that matters. So that's harder work to do, I guess, in the 21st century, but because our popular culture is different. But it is really kind of neat the way that Richard is like pointing you in all these different directions where, you know, the beast or these numbers and so on that we'll get to, they all have these kind of like cool echoes throughout the biblical anti-imperial tradition.
Okay, well, let's get into some of the big mythological moments here. Dean read the bit about the beasts moments ago, and they're big and they're spooky and weird. But there's another character in amongst the beasts who are giving them their power. Let's start with that character. That's the dragon. He's also Satan. The dragon is. He's not any other kind of dragon. Not the cool kind. He's the bad kind. Okay, so Revelation 12 kicks off with a scene that's happening in heaven. So before we get to the beasts, which are in the sea and on earth, we have a whole sort of like wild moment in heaven. So up in heaven, there's a great portent. A woman who is clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head is a crown of 12 stars, is pregnant. She had a baby, it's a boy, and there's a dragon that wants to eat this baby. The baby is spirited away up to God for safekeeping. But there is a dragon, and this causes a war in heaven. A war breaks out where there is Michael and his angels. Michael is an interesting character who Richard reminds us comes from the book of Daniel. So that's cool. Michael is the one that I guess all good Catholics and Anglo-Catholic Episcopalians know, because you get to say the cool prayer of St. Michael about fighting the devil. But this is where all of that kind of comes in. We have Michael and the angels fighting the dragon up in heaven. The dragon and his angels fight back, but they're defeated, and they get cast out of heaven down to earth. This is actually an important bit for the entire story of the beast, because it is the dragon, it's the devil or Satan, whichever name you want to give this guy, is the one who is giving the sort of like his authority, his power to the beasts on earth. And that will come into play quite a bit throughout this chapter. Let me read this bit from Richard about Michael, and we can kind of talk more about the war in heaven, as it were. The figure of Michael is taken from Daniel 10:13 and 21, especially from 12:1, where we hear that at the time there shall arise Michael, the great prince and guardian of your people. Speaking of the Israelites at the moment, Michael offers assurance that in the time of tribulation, your people shall escape, again, signaling the Exodus narrative that we know previously, though I guess for Daniel it'd be Babylon. So, this is sort of, like Dean said, a pastiche of liberation stories stacked on top of each other. Anyways, we have Michael, together with his angels, as a mythological figure representing the transcendent and spiritual force of the people of God. Richard references there Exodus 23, which is now going to confront the spiritual and transcendent force of the empire represented by the dragon and his angels. So the war in heaven is this like precursor to the trials and tribulations of Christians resisting the empire on earth. We have this kind of big story of an epic battle up in heaven where Satan is cast out, Satan is defeated, the dragon is thrown out of there. We see Satan fall like lightning from heaven, from Luke, I guess, is that great reference. But it's important though, because it's a recognition that evil evil in the big cosmic sense has been defeated. So, don't even worry about it. You'll have to deal with it on Earth for sure. But up here, things are sorted. So it's kind of a recognition that, like, ultimately God is in control. God's already won. Don't worry about it. There's gonna be some problems down on Earth because, like, that's where Satan gets thrown to. But but sort of in the ultimate sense, there's a recognition of victory.
Yeah, not super comforting, I gotta tell you. It sort of feels like, man, you probably should have kept the devil quarantined up there. But something I think that is really interesting here is the kind of, like, I mentioned there's like a parallelism between what's happening in heaven and what's happening on Earth. We'll get to that in a minute. But there's also often these kind of like mirrors between the kind of like evil in Revelation is often an inversion of what's going on the heavenly side. So in the same way that the dragon as Satan is this kind of like embodiment of evil, Michael becomes the champion of the people of God. And so you have these kind of, different sort of opportunities to like create a contradiction of seemingly equally matched powers. But then, of course, God is always the one wins, or the side of God wins. The figure of the dragon and Satan is also very interesting in Richard's reading. So at one point he says, "Who is the devil or Satan?" And this is Richard's hot take. "It is clearly a mythical personification of evil, of iniquity, of lawlessness, of sin. Devil is the Greek translation in the Septuagint," that's the Greek version of the Bible, "of the Hebrew term Satan. Its general meaning is adversary, accuser, calumniator. It does not mean an eternal or absolute personal agent existing forever just like God, as in Eastern Manichaean mythologies. God created all things and everything created by God was good. There's no such thing as the devil as an absolute personal agent. It is a myth to personify evil." So for Richard, the myth that's being offered here, the dragon is kind of the literary expression, like the shorthand for talking about the kind of like huge crystallization of all the forces of what he calls personal and social sin all combined together into this one spooky monster. And that monster is trying to, wage war on heaven, trying to defeat heaven. And eventually that will be defeated by Michael. And that's where I think the kind of symbolism stuff is quite interesting, because it's like, the temptation and the reality, I guess, of the Western Christian tradition is to take figures like the devil and Michael as like, real people out there who are doing X, Y, or Z. And what Richard is saying is like, really, these are the ways that someone in this specific first century of Rome is trying to express a pretty complicated idea, right? That there's like a lot of kind of spiritual, for lack of a better term, force, like there's a constellation of evil that kind of becomes, if you had to make it stand in for something, the devil, and then Michael similarly stands in for the people of God who also defeat the devil. So there's a cool kind of like spiritual material meaning to each of these big metaphysical kaijus fighting in the sky. And I think that is very cool to be like, this is John's way of, expressing a systematic understanding of good and evil, even you might say a kind of materialist understanding of good and evil, but with the mythical tools available to him.
Yeah, I guess I have a lot of like weird feelings about this. Not, I think it's interesting. It's all super interesting, and I think like I guess the weird feeling I have about this is that, as like a modern person, a contemporary person, or whatever, someone who's living at the same time roughly as Pablo Richard, to be like, these are all mythologies that he's like using to kind of explain a complex idea to somebody, is like, that is true. I guess that makes sense, but also it makes me feel like a little bit of like a smug modernist, be like, these are really just stand-ins for these other complex ideas that we're like really smart about and we already kind of have figured out. So I don't know. It's fine. I'm happy just to like let it be and kind of have fun with it. I like the idea. I guess I like the idea that we can have these guys be the big cosmic kaiju if we want them to be, and that's fine.
I think that's true. I guess what's interesting is it kind of begs the question of like, if you were a person sitting down and on the island of Patmos writing an insane book like this, do you feel like you're actually expressing for lack of a better term, like the truth of the cosmos, that there's a big dragon flying around up there and there's a guy named Michael who comes to defeat him or whatever? Or are you kind of generating images that allow you to kind of make a different point, or make a broader point in a way that, in a way that you can't do if you don't have like Marxism available to you or something like that? I think there is like, there is a temptation, and Marxists do it all the time in ways that are extremely annoying, to be like, well, this person is really trying to make a point about the economy when in fact they were smart enough to know that like spirituality is fake, right? That's like Engels' reading of Thomas Müntzer, for example. And that's very silly. I think, trying to say like, this is just a way of like duping your community, or like condescending down to like the other dummies around you who are not going to get your profound materialist point, like that's a bad way to read history. But I think what Richard is doing is something a little different, where he's trying to say this is the power of myth is not to like hide the point that you want to make. It's actually the way to make the point that you want to make in a way that you couldn't do if you were just writing like, I don't know, a book of philosophy like Plato or something like that. Like, this is like the way of expressing the reality of evil, which is actually bigger than just being like, I don't know, it's bad people doing bad stuff. It's like it takes on a kind of cosmic figure because it seems to have an almost like cosmic significance,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, cool. Cool. Great. So
maybe they are. I don't know. Maybe they are cosmic kaiju, and that's what he's talking about, and that's fine with me too. I would be okay with it. It would be fine with me. And if a Catholic priest emails me and says, actually, they're real, that's fine, Father. I'll believe you. No big deal. But I think it's interesting to do this kind of weird exercise of like reading the production of myth so intentionally as like a exercising production.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. I mean, whatever. I guess I don't feel that strongly about it, about any of it, one way or the other. I like that these guys are up there and they're fighting. I think that's a really cool thing. I like that we get to do the prayer of St. Michael. I think that's really fun. So like, whatever. Don't even stress about these two guys up there doing their thing, doing their big fight. Just like, it's cool, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That's the reason why we're reading about it in church rather than listening to the pastor. All right. So Michael throws the devil out of heaven down to earth. And now the devil's down here doing evil down here. And the thing that I guess
up there.
Thanks for nothing. I guess you figured it out up there. But I guess the interesting thing, kind of going back to the bits from the biblical text about the beasts, the two different beasts, is that in both cases, certainly find exactly the quote I'm looking for from the Bible. So in both cases, the beasts that come from the sea and from the land, they make an explicit statement that the dragon has given his authority to the beast, especially in Revelation 13, where we have the beast coming from the sea. They worship the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can stand against it?" So the devil gets cast out of heaven. He's on earth, and then he says, "All right, I've been beaten up there, but down here, I'm giving all of my power to the beast." And by beast, we mean Rome. We mean the empire. So that is, I guess, the pivot point in the story that's quite important. Satan is defeated in heaven, and then Satan goes to earth and gives his power to empires. Wild.
Wild. That's right. As Richard puts it, the empire represents what is bestial in history, and the people of God represent what is human. The beast represents not only one Roman empire or another, but the empires in their entirety. 7 heads equals 7 kings. 7 being like the number that symbolizes completeness or totality. And likewise, he represents the entire imperial structure. The beast is a whole system, one that is universal and total. It has power over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation. The beast is the entire empire in its economic, political, social dimension, and especially its religious, theological, and spiritual dimension. So what's really interesting too here is that parallelism shows up again, where the dragon gives his power to the beast, and the beast becomes the kind of like physical manifestation of satanic power, whereas the people of God, those who are being pursued by the beast, they similarly have the power of the Lamb. They share in that power, as we've talked about in past episodes, going through Richard's book. And similarly, they also become the kind of physical or earthly manifestation of that divine power. So what had happened in heaven is now happening in parallel on earth, but almost to like a lesser degree, like the devil and Michael are both maybe like replaced by, earthly representations. And I think putting it that way is also really fascinating, like the beast is one big spooky thing, but the people of God is also like a really cool imaginative like alternative, like they also inherit a certain metaphysical superpower. It's just that it comes from somewhere else. So there's all this supernatural stuff going on in the background, but they're kind of empowering what's going on Earth.
What I find so interesting about that particular schema, where there's like, the Satan is empowering the beast or empire, and not only just, I mean, we've been saying this whole time that the beast is Rome, and this is a whole kind of big anti-imperialist diatribe, and that's true, but it's not just Rome. It's like the whole schema of empire, the whole schema of like oppression of other people is the beast, which is such an interesting thing, because again, kind of relating it to the way that like Marxists will talk about things, it's like the Marxist observation that if whatever, like all of the capitalists were to disappear tomorrow or something, it wouldn't stop other capitalists from kind of stepping in or whatever and taking their place. And it's the same kind of idea here, that there's a whole sort of like potentiality, I guess, in what we're talking about when it comes to the beast. It's not just that the Roman Empire is bad. It's the whole idea, like the tendency toward empire, the tendency toward systems of oppression that are particularly bad, that we have to kind of figure out how to unravel. But don't worry, they've been defeated in heaven, so not that big of a deal.
Just a matter of time.
Yeah, exactly. So we have these two different beasts. We have the dragon. Paulo Richard has, I think, a bit more to say about the beasts and their particular like iconography and like metaphorical, representational, sort of mythological aspects, with regard to the diadems on their head and the sweeping the stars out of the sky and all. And even like the one of the beasts has suffered a fatal wound and then is healed.
Oh yeah,
which is quite interesting.
We should talk about that.
We should. So just like at the level of like sort of symbolism, Richard says that the beast who suffers a mortal wound and then is healed is perhaps a reference to some mythology surrounding the Roman Emperor Nero, who there's quite a bit of sort of like death and resurrection lore around, which I thought was quite interesting. Do you want to say more about that, Dean?
Yeah. So Nero, the idea is that he was potentially defeated or like deposed, or I don't know all the details of it, but Nero is, for some people understood to be the kind of like the emperor stand-in for the persecution of Christians in early Christian mythology. And so the idea is that Nero, he was going to be deposed, but then he comes back and he assumes power once again. So that's one kind of reading of the mortally wounded head, is that just like Nero, well, that head represents Nero, I guess, like the guy who was defeated but couldn't actually be defeated. There's also a reading here from Richard. He's like trying on a few different possibilities, where maybe that is the result of losing the war in heaven, where you thought that the dragon was defeated, but guess what? He's back. The mortal wound has been healed. He was not actually defeated. He just retreated to Earth, and now he needs to be finally defeated. That's another way of looking at it. And I mean, there's a few other pieces in there, but it's interesting to kind of read it as like almost the dashed hope that the empire might fall, that like maybe your persecutor would die, but actually they come back. It's the kind of thing that you see all the time in the history of revolutionary movements, including in the first century, where a big revolution seems to be on the winning side, and then finally, at the last second, they can't pull it off. So that's like one of these heads is, one who survived being defeated.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Okay, let's move on a little bit more to talk about the beast and idolatry, because that ends up being like a pretty central theme to this. So, like I mentioned a minute ago, we have Satan, who gives their authority to the beast, and then the beast is, there are people who are worshiping the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" Which should probably ring some bells off in your head to remind you of some other things. I'll read this from Richard, and we can all be on the same page together. The worship of the beast is expressed in two rhetorical questions asked by those who adore it. Who can compare with the beast, or who can fight against it? No one is the implicit answer. The beast is a unique and absolute subject. No other subject exists. The logical consequence is a total submission to it. Resistance and struggle against the beast is ruled out. Idolaters actually must have said, "What is there like the Roman Empire? Nothing. Who can struggle against it? No one." Worship of the empire thus consists in absolutizing it completely, leading to its complete subjection. In the Bible, the claim that Yahweh is the only God is made in similar terms in Exodus 15. Who is like to you among the gods, O Lord? Which the implicit answer is no one. This is super interesting because, it's sometimes we read the word idolatry and we think of it only in like purely religious terms of putting like some other false god before, the one true God or something. But putting it in terms of empire and the totalizing aspects of empire is actually really fascinating, and it is a very cool anti-imperialist critique, one that I think, is still very relevant. The idea, even if we were to say not Rome, but another empire, the United States, it would feel just as real, or maybe it would feel more real to us or something. Like, how could anyone actually resist and struggle against the United States? Iran, do you think that they could actually resist the United States war machine? Absolutely not. Like the Taliban, no. The idea of terrorism, of course not. It couldn't stand against the United States, right? And that is an idolatrous thought, the idea that nothing can topple the empire. But it's an idolatrous thought that doesn't like appear idolatrous to us because we're not, quite used to seeing things in that register. But these are the ways that the political and the religious are like intertwined for the, this particular biblical text. And it is very interesting.
Yeah, that kind of, whether it's celebratory or depressive, that sentiment that nobody can stand against the empire is such a familiar trope in our own time. There's the way that you just expressed it, where some people are like, I guess, there's a kind of right-wing and even liberal myth of American exceptionalism where, at the end of the day, people think that they could resist the U.S., but in fact, nobody can really do it. So that's an expression like kind of on the side of empire or on the part of empire. There's also, if you think of maybe like a left-wing resistance to empire rather than the, like weird kind of symptoms of terrorism in our age, like there's a sense too, I think, of a kind of left-wing defeatism where it's like, you hope that a country like Cuba can hang on or whatever, but also you're like, I don't know, man, it's just probably a matter of time. They're going to starve them out. That's like the same position, but from a different point of view, I guess. And then you kind of also have like a certain left-wing or even liberal defeatism in places like the US, where things are so bad and the populace is so ideologized that you're like, what's even the point of talking to these people? Or I never want to talk to my neighbor, or all that kind of stuff, because nobody's ever going to change. Nothing's going to change. That too is a kind of idolatry, according to Revelation. And I really like that premise that like part of what it means to resist idolatry is to actually resist the notion that any kind of empire is total or final or ultimate. And that's like an expression of faith. That's the kind of thing that, as cheesy as it sounds, you can kind of only believe if you think that empire is finally defeated in heaven, even if it doesn't look like it here, And I think that's really interesting to be like, part of being a Christian on the left is maybe to hold open a very stubborn kind of commitment to the idea that every single empire ultimately is going to pass away, and that's really important. It kind of reminded me of Mitri Raheb, a really cool Palestinian Lutheran pastor. He has a book called Decolonizing Palestine, and in it he talks about this moment where Jesus says, the meek will inherit the earth. And he has this really interesting reading of that where he's like, if you're a Palestinian, it doesn't really look that way. It doesn't look like the meek are inheriting the earth over here. It actually looks kind of the opposite. And so he says he's kind of struggled with that as a pastor to preach on that important moment from one of Jesus's most popular sermons. But he finally reads it by saying, if you're a Palestinian, you have also seen the fall of empire after empire, Babylon, Rome, all kinds of other empires, the Ottoman Empire, different empires that have kind of come and gone. And the people themselves are those who have survived all of that. And it's ultimately the people who will inherit the land, even when the empire is gone. So I think there's something like that happening here, it probably isn't going to happen tomorrow or whatever, but to sort of concede the position of pessimism or the position of imperial optimism that ultimately there's no way of opposing this thing even in our lifetime, that in itself is a kind of idolatrous opinion. I think that is actually a very challenging and important word for me specifically to hear. So it's a great kind of provocation from the book of Revelation.
Yeah, that's a really good connection to make. The thing that I went to, which is completely a different direction, was that there's this book that I've read quite a few times by a French philosopher named Jean Baudrillard, someone I like to talk about and think about still. He has a book called The Spirit of Terrorism, and it is primarily about thinking about the terror attacks of 9/11. And basically, the book overall is about how something as totalizing as the United States empire, he sometimes just calls it the West, which is wrong, but whatever, you get the idea. How it can breed its own sort of fracturing, and how that fracturing is often expressed through terrorism. But in the beginning of the book, he lays out all of these kind of interesting sort of aphorisms and turns of phrase about the ways that the West and the United States are framed as this sort of completeness that can't be overcome by anything. And he has this phrase that made me think a lot about this bit about the beasts and who can stand against it. And speaking about 9/11, he's people frame the United States as this type of stable totality that it's not that the airplanes flew into the World Trade Centers and knocked it down. It's that the airplanes the terrorists on the planes committed suicide, and then the towers committed suicide right after, in response or something like that, demonstrating that it's it's that terrorism couldn't even touch the empire or something. No one can actually stand against it. So anyways, it kind of made me feel a lot of things about that, about the ways that we think of the United States as something that can't end, or has really no one has any chance of interfering with or having an intervention against or something. But a really complex idea actually in Revelation.
Yeah.
Not just an empire, but the whole sort of thrust of imperialism as form that exists within human history, and liberation on the other end, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, it also reminds me, just speaking of Baudrillard, he's the poster person for somebody who has basically just given up on the emancipatory project of the left because it is, judged out of hand as being impossible. And it is funny to be Baudrillard is actually the ultimate idolater in a certain way, even if he is a very incisive critic of empire. Intriguing. I mean, that is a problem in general with the so-called postmodern left. I hate the way that Marxists talk about postmodern philosophy. They're very bad at reading it, but there's something true about that. Postmodernism in general kind of retreats away, assuming that, I don't know, things are just kind of the way they are. The best you can do is remix them, or I don't know, learn how to read about them. All right. Looking at the time here, we're definitely not going to get to everything in this chapter, and that's fine. But I definitely think we should talk about the Mark of the Beast before this is over. So
Yeah,
let
big
me
time.
get us there, and then we'll talk
Please.
about it. Okay. One quick note that I think is really neat, just to close the loop on some of these parallelisms going on. Pablo Richard talks about the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet as constituting a perverse trinity. He says the relationship between the three is like that of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Satan is the anti-Father, the beast is the anti-Son, and the false prophet is the anti-Holy Spirit. At the center of this perverse trinity stands the beast. Just as all of Revelation is Christocentric, the oppressive structures are similarly bestiocentric. Whether or not there is a Trinitarianism at work here in Revelation, which is a debatable idea, the idea that the perverse structures are bestiocentric is very cool. So just wanted to get that word out here on the table. We have not talked that much about the false prophet, but now that we move into the Mark of the Beast, we are going to have to. The false prophet, he is also the beast who comes out of the earth, the one who looks kind of like the lamb with a couple of horns and represents the beast and really tries to discipline everybody into making sure that they worship the beast. That's his job. And part of that also involves kind of the expression of the 666 number. So let me read, maybe, let's see, the best way of going about this. They're somewhat different, the Mark of the Beast and 666 per se. What's the best way to make this make sense?
Start with 666, then we'll talk about the other part.
Yeah. All right, let's go with 666. So here is how Richard parses it out. The aim is to interpret the meaning of the number, not to decipher the name that the number expresses. Since the number 6 means imperfection or lack, and 7 expresses perfection or fullness, 666 would accordingly mean utter imperfection or lack. 6 is repeated 3 times because it is asymptotic number. It is ever imperfect to the infinite, so 666 repeating infinitely. And he adds that asymptotic comes from asymptote, a negative, which means to unite. A line extending indefinitely and approaching a curve but never touching it is asymptotic. If you're a math person, I'm sure you're screaming at my bad way of reading this, but you get the point. I get the point despite not being a mathematician. I feel like it's helpful to kind of read it that way, right? You're like always kind of getting close to a curve, but you never actually get there. When 7 is mentioned, it is mentioned only once, for it's a perfect number. So there's 666, but 7 is a complete number here. The name of the beast, which everyone knows, when put in number form, expresses this utter imperfection or lack. The beast has 7 heads, which also means 7 kings, which is the fullness of power. That 7, however, is an illusion. 5 are fallen, the 6th is now in place, and the 7th will not last long. The beast makes an 8th, he creates an 8th head. But as one of the 7, this 8th destroys the perfection, and so everything is heading toward destruction. So, contrary to what the evangelicals want you to think, they're not stamping a big 666 in your barcodes or whatever, or your social security number. 666 is this kind of, like pretty heavily laden expression of the lack or imperfection of the beast, which I think is actually very cool and interesting. It tries to approximate God, but never gets there. That's really consistent with so many other things we've talked about, these kind of weird parallelisms where, the dragon is almost like Michael or almost like the lamb, but really not quite. So we see that going on here. That feeds us in here to the Mark of the Beast. And in Richard's reading, the Mark of the Beast has really mostly to do with the kind of stamping on not like a person per se. Like the metaphor should be the stamping of a mark or a face onto a currency. And this is where you get some really great discourse about money. So let me just read this and then I'll stop and we can parse it out some more. Richard says, if the image of the beast is really the depiction of the empire on Roman coins, the meaning would be that Roman money is the visible representation of the empire's spirit. Money is fetishized and becomes an active subject. It has spirit and life, and it speaks and kills. Money becomes the image of the beast being worshipped, the idol being worshipped, the divinity being worshipped. Money becomes, in Jesus' words, mammon, the god of this world, the lord of this world. Money is something inert that the false prophet turns into a living subject. What speaks and kills is not money as a thing in itself, but rather the spirit of the empire. Nevertheless, money now takes on the qualities of a subject and appears as the visible body of the empire's invisible spirit, and as such, it is alive, speaks, and kills. In Revelation, it's the one who gives life and power to the Roman Empire. Money now becomes the body of Satan. Extremely cool. This kind of maps onto the kind of general theory of idolatry that Pablo Richard specifically has, and you can read more about that in our book that comes out next month, Enough is Enough, where we talk about Richard and his theory of idolatry. That's a quick plug, I guess. But the kind of theology behind it here is that what idolatry does is it takes something that we've created, like money, something inert, and then we imbue it with some kind of agency or power, and then we submit ourselves to it, and we pattern our lives around it. And for Richard, the function of the prophet here, the false prophet, the beast of the earth, is to basically shore up money, to organize the world in terms of money. That is how you end up offering your worship to the beast, is by, participating in an fundamentally unjust economy. So the mark of the beast 666 is really the acceptance of the kind of pretensions of imperialism. You accept that the empire can never be challenged, and you also understand that it is incomplete. It is a kind of system of chaos. And the means, but what that does, by accepting that, it allows you to participate in the monetary economy. And as we know from some past chapters, what John is saying is you've got to get out of that. You got to pull yourself out of the unjust circulation of a bad, evil, structurally violent economy. So a pretty wild stuff here with this perverse trinity going on. The dragon gave its power to the beast. The beast is trusting the false prophet to make sure everybody is worshiping the beast. And the way that the prophet does that is by activating money. That's the true image of the beast. Matt, what do you think about all that, this big corkboard that I've pulled together for you?
No, it's great. It is definitely a big corkboard. I guess the strings that I'm connecting on this corkboard are, before we had, Satan comes down from heaven because Michael kicks his butt so hard he falls down to earth. And then Satan gives his power and authority to the beast. But here in the mark of the beast bit, we have money as being sort of like the idolatrous thing that's come into existence, that has been kind of imbued with power. He says the one who gives life and power to the Roman Empire is money, and it now has become the body of Satan. We get the idea that money is idolatrous, but also that money is satanic, that money is the thing that is giving power to the empire. I guess it's interesting to me because what we end up with is something that's actually kind of out of Marx, I guess. We have in the Communist Manifesto, Marx makes he says the spooky thing about money, where the relations of production and exchange are a sorcerer who's conjuring up the powers of the nether, and it kind of gets out from under him in a big sort of Mickey Mouse Fantasia sort of way. And I guess that's kind of what we're seeing here too, though, is that the empire creates money gets kind of out from under the empire and imbues the empire with its power, so it's out of control in this big weird circular dance of idolatrous and satanic things. It's great. Love it.
It is great. There are so many things to say about it. I guess it kind of goes back to the conversation we were having about myth and what it can do, how it can help express what's going on here. There are so many interesting things. There's quite a long section on money in the book, and I guess if you're really into this conversation, you should check it out. But something that Richard goes on to say, just to kind of pull the myth home, he says this economic integration into the market is in turn a symbol of integration into all of the empire's structures. Since Christians reject the idolatry of the beast and of money, they don't have the stamp of the beast, are not identified as belonging to the empire, and so are made outcasts and ultimately are murdered. They're sentenced to death economically by being excluded from the market, and they're sentenced to death politically, culturally, and spiritually for not acknowledging the beast as a god. Christians refuse to be turned into objects of Baal, the empire god, and into objects of Mammon, the money god. Satan is the power of the beast and of the image of the beast, He's the supernatural force of evil that Christians and martyrs have also defeated. And that is why Christians understand that the Roman Empire is not an absolute subject that no one can resist. That, I think, is really cool. We can talk more about how Christians resist it later, because Richard is also very insistent that Revelation is not a book of passivity, which I'm not totally sold on yet. That is something we were kind of wrestling with last week, and I don't know. He's going to have to do some work to convince me, and, he might do it. I'm willing to be convinced. I'd like to be convinced. But nevertheless, I do think that the kind of idea that really what John is doing here is giving Christians a way to kind of understand why they're excluded from the economy and why they would actually choose to suffer in that specific way. That is a pretty cool contribution, I think.
Very interesting. The corkboard, oh my gosh, it's got so many strings on it right now. I think we have to put a pin in it, though, in the corkboard. We have to walk away from the corkboard for the time being. We'll talk more maybe about resistance and the more angels, more plagues, more trumpets and bowls next time on the Magnificast. But before we go, Dean, what's your current sort of reading on the Book of Revelation? How are you feeling now that we've gotten up to chapter 15?
Yeah, well, last week I felt badly about it. I felt like I'm not sure about this guy. He seems pretty pissed off, very crabby, really angry, and I actually don't really want to be like that. But this time around, I have come back around. I think similar to the way that John reads the horses and creates the horsemen as ways of kind of getting his head around some pretty sophisticated understandings of the Roman economy, I think here too, there's actually a really neat sort of spiritual opposition that's being produced, and a spiritual language that allows us to kind of understand what it means to be a Christian person in an age of empire. And I think that is actually giving me a lot of kind of hope right now in a moment of, a pretty vicious news cycle and a lot of bad stuff going on. And I think that is pretty neat, being like, Christians are the people who look at empires and say, actually, that's not going to last. Even though it looks like it does, some way, somehow, it won't do that. That is like a huge faith statement that appears irrational given the kind of rationality of empire. And I am happy to take that on board this time around. What about you, Matt? How are you feeling after getting through this bit?
Yeah, it's all piling up for me in one big wreckage. At the end of history here, we've read this stuff about the anti-imperialist nature of the Book of Revelation. We've read Jesus as sort of like a political organizer in William Herzog and some other sort of historians who are looking at the gospel and early Christian communities in this sort of critical way. And I guess what I'm left with is Christianity has gotten so weird since we've kind of forgotten these grounding relationships between marginalized people and empire. Christianity is fundamentally about that dynamic, but we've gone, but it has become a very weird sort of self-help kind of overly spiritualized thing. Not that there's nothing, not that that doesn't have its place, I guess, and there's some nice things about that. But I guess what I feel like after reading this book about Revelation, especially, is that Christians really need to reclaim and refigure out that particular dynamic and how Christians in the past have resisted empire and how that needs to become, I think, a central idea to our religious practice. That I don't know, we've come so far. We've come so far from it all.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. And if you do that, you can join our Discord community, which is a lot of fun. Some great conversations about angels and whether or not they have bodies and what they can and can't do with them going on in there right now. So come check that out. Let's see. If you want more content about idolatry, you can get our book Enough is Enough from Fortress Press, which comes out in almost a month from now exactly on May 12. You can pre-order it at Fortress. You can get it wherever else you get books, whatever. Request it at your local library. Ask your bookstore to hold on to a couple of copies. I don't know, whatever. It's a book that we worked really hard on, and if you like this podcast, you're gonna be fine with the book. It'll be good. Our music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Beside, what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear, do you really mean this? I said, I only know what I feel right now. I said, poets lie, sometime come true. Stay awake with me, where see what we can do. Poets lie, sometime come true. Stay awake with me, where see what we can do in my town. I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to